begin. Welcome everyone. I'm Bob Russell, founder and director of CTNS, and delighted to have you here for our last public forum of the academic year. Public forums are part of our mission to support the creative mutual interaction between theology and science with research, teaching, and public service. And it's a pleasure to see former and present and past students here as well. That's great. Thank you for coming. Many dear colleagues. Tonight's speaker, Celia Deane-Drummond, is one of the most unusual persons in this field. She's got 2 PhDs. She's a doctorate in plant physiology and a doctorate in systematic theology. That's really impressive. There are very few people who have achieved that distinction, and Celia bears it well. She is now in Notre Dame, where she's been for a dozen years, and is professor in theology at Notre Dame and the director of the Center for Theology, Science, and Human Flourishing. Her program is incredibly broad. We're going to get a snap of some of the central issues in her talk today: empathy and evolution and compassion. One of the things I appreciate so much about Celia is her participation in CTNS. She was our J.K. Russell Fellow in the year 2006-07. We had a wonderful conference. And I'll just say one of the most important points she made, or impression she made on me, was the point that there really are deep roots to almost every human characteristic, and particularly moral behavior, and that you can see through animal ethology sort of aspects of what we call moral behavior, even in, say, canines who broke off from us hundreds of millions of years ago, probably further. And so there's species-specific moral behavior, as well as that behavior is latent to what becomes true moral behavior in all species. There's a wonderful conversation about that, and we had Mark Beck up here and others who do a lot of work in animal ethology. So I'm looking forward to tonight's talk. It sounds like we're going to see some continuity and something quite new as well. She's on the beginning of soon to have a 2-year sabbatic. That's pretty impressive. I've never been able to wait a 2-year sabbatic, so hats off to you, Celia. I hope you can spend some of your time here. And I think you'll find her a delightful speaker and a really wonderful person. So please help me welcome Celia Deane-Drummond.
Yes, thank you for coming out on this cool evening. I wasn't expecting California to be colder than South Bend, Indiana, but it's a real pleasure to be here again after 10 years. And I have to say that my thinking in the last 10 years was really heavily influenced by the conference I came to in 2006-07. So I really do owe a huge debt of gratitude to Bob Russell and CTNS for that Russell Fellowship, because it really did achieve what it was designed for, and that is to kickstart a whole new charge of research and take it, and it's still going on as well. So, you know, I really found that a really, really fruitful experience, and thank you so much again. I can publicly say that. What I'm going to do today is I'm going to look at a sort of small slice of where I've come to now, and really where I'm going to next, in a kind of nutshell. And I'm going to start with a psychological debate around empathy. And so I'm going to be looking at sort of current psychology, but also some evolutionary aspects as well. And it's part of a wider project I'm working on at the moment on the evolution of morality. I wrote a book on theological anthropology that was published in 2014 called The Wisdom of the Liminal, Evolution, Other Animals and Human Becoming. And in that book I raised various virtues like justice, for example, but I didn't have the chance to really go into it in enough detail, and I didn't look at the evolution. I looked at some of the evolutionary aspects of compassion, but I didn't actually look at the psychological parts of that puzzle. So working in this multidisciplinary field is a huge challenge, because you need to be a polymath in all sorts of areas and not just one or two. But I want to begin to build a philosophical, a theological argument for empathy against those psychologists who argue against empathy, and on the same side as other psychologists who are arguing for empathy. So I'm going to join the debate, as it were, but through a sort of theological and philosophical lens as well as through a scientific one, because I think that we can align ourselves to different parts of the debate in a way that's quite fruitful. And it's the same with debates in evolutionary biology in general. There's a debate going on at the moment between the classic neo-Darwinian theories and what's called the extended evolutionary synthesis theories, and I align myself with the latter because I think it's more fruitful the way we think about who we are as human beings. It also resonates more easily with aspects of theology in a way that the classic neo-Darwinian paradigm does not. So I'm doing something similar now. I mean, I'm not going to be tackling, many of those aspects of evolutionary biology directly, but if there are questions afterwards, I'm very happy to take those. So, this is in a nutshell and where I'm going. So first of all, introducing Paul Bloom's arguments against empathy and some of his critics. And Paul Bloom, I should say, is a very prominent psychologist who has attracted a lot of public attention. And then I'm going to look at the relationship between empathy and compassion using Martha Nussbaum's theories, who's a very prominent philosopher who's worked quite a lot on aspects of justice making. She comes from Chicago, and I find her work really interesting, and yet I'm also critical of it in the light of some of this new research. And then I'm going to look at Penny Spicken's work, who's an evolutionary anthropologist from York University in England, and she's done some really, really fascinating work on the evolution of compassion, which is completely different from much of the archaeological evolutionary approach that we find up till now has been dominating the evolution of hominids landscape. She's looking at the evolution of the inner world and not just the outer world, which is reflected in bones and so on. So it's how do you find these characteristics that have been left behind in the evolutionary record that tells you something about what was going on in the mind. And I find that, again, that it's a really fascinating discussion. I then turn to some of our own work. One of the grants that we've kind of been successful in is on human distinctiveness, and part of that is on the evolution of wisdom. And this is something that's occupied my imagination for 10 or 15 years or more, and it was only when I came to Notre Dame that I had a chance to collaborate with evolutionary anthropologists who thought, yeah, well, maybe that's a good idea, let's look at that. So, and as a scientist and as a theologian, I got really excited about this project, and I hope to show you one of the reasons why it's becoming even more interesting than I anticipated. And then we will fold it back then into a discussion of transcendent compassion and the different kinds of ways of thinking about what compassion might mean, including work from Thomas Aquinas, the classic medieval writer, who's been hugely influential, not just in Catholic circles, but also in Protestant circles as well. I mean, I'm going to come to a few tentative conclusions. And feel free if, if I'm going too fast or if you don't follow, then, if you want to just interrupt, then that's just a question of clarification, then feel free. Otherwise we can wait till the end. So here is his book then, Against Empathy. Couldn't be much clearer than that, and it's only just been published. And according to Bloom, anyway, empathy is biased. And this is what he says. Empathy is biased. We are more prone to feel empathy for attractive people and for those who look like us or share our ethnic or national background. And empathy is narrow. It connects us to particular individuals, real or imagined, but is insensitive to numerical differences and statistical data. So what he's saying then is that empathy is not really of any use in the moral life because it sort of pushes us towards affiliations which may not be all that helpful to making good choices. So instead he argues for a utilitarian calculus, that we should work out what is going to be the sum total of benefits for the most people, and we should go, we should make our decisions on that basis. The only problem with his view is, just as he's saying that empathy is biased, I think that the utilitarian calculus that he uses is also biased, because if a minority group pushes for a certain position, and you work out what the calculus says in terms of the sum total of happiness, then those particular views are bound to be excluded. So he hasn't really solved the problem that he found himself with the empathy. And it also supposes that those who support empathy aren't aware of some of the problems associated with empathy. And in other words, there are more qualities that are needed than just empathy. Other qualities are needed in order to make good moral choices. One of the things that Paul Bloom raises is how many of us are hypersensitive, where we see suffering, and in those situations our empathy gets in the way of making good decisions, because we cannot think clearly, because we're so wounded, as it were, by the other person's pain, and we end up being sort of frozen in our decision making. And then eventually you have burnout. So people who've been working in very difficult situations as nurses, or some others who are working with people who are trauma victims and so on, end up in the end not being able to function properly. But it doesn't mean that empathy is redundant just because there are occasions where people have an excess of what empathy might do. So Spezio, or Michael Spezio, is someone who works at Scripps College, which I think is quite close. Well, I think it's in California. I'm pretty sure it's California.
In Claremont, just outside of LA.
Okay, yeah, good. So I got the right general area. Thank you. So he says that empathy has cognitive as well as emotive elements. So he argues against Bloom that empathy is this kind of rather uncontrollable emotional facet of our moral thinking that isn't really any use. And instead, he says that actually we should put empathy back in the picture instead of trying to take it out. So there's this really interesting double debate going on amongst the psychologists. And what I'm going to do today is I'm going to look at two different elements that, if you like, back up Michael Spezio as being on the right track rather than Paul Bloom. First of all, I'm going to look at evolutionary anthropology and track where compassion and empathy associated with it seems to have appeared in the evolutionary record. And then I'm going to look at theology and look at the idea of infused virtue. In other words, this kind of superabundant of empathy. But let's start with the philosophical positions. Martha Nussbaum, in her book on the fragility of goodness, and some other books that she's written on this topic, has said that for the last 2,500 years we've been speculating about whether empathy is of any use in the moral life. So Paul Bloom hasn't raised anything new. In fact, he's forgotten about some of this very long-standing history. She doesn't talk about Paul Bloom herself, but in this book she looks at this particular debate. So the debates in the classic tradition were mostly on eudaimonia, that is, what makes for flourishing, rather than compassion. Compassion in general is ignored or marginalized. And this then impacts on Spinoza, Descartes, Kant, Smith, and Nietzsche, and of course Bloom, although he doesn't recognize it. Why? Why should we ignore compassion? Again, in this tradition, it's because compassion is incapable of making good moral judgments. But those in the pro-compassion school admit that it can be faulty. And this is what she says about those in the pro-compassion school. The pro-compassion tradition is preoccupied with getting the theory of value right, criticizing those who attach inappropriate importance to money, status, or pleasure. So Nussbaum also defines empathy in a different kind of way as well. This is how she defines empathy. It's an imaginative reconstruction of another person's experience without any particular evaluation of that experience. So I'll just say that again, an imaginative reconstruction of another person's experience without any particular evaluation of that experience. The judgment that a person is in distress and the desire to do something about it is the judgment of compassion. So you have empathy, which allows us to recognize that someone is in distress, but you need compassion in order to act on behalf of that individual. And she argues that compassion has three elements of judgment, all of which are cognitive, if you like. The first element is one of size. That is, this is a serious thing that has happened to someone. So it's about the scale. The second one is one of non-desert. That person didn't deserve to have this thing happen to them. The third one is eudaimonistic. That is, this particular person's suffering is significant in relation to my goals or my sense of where I'm going. And then there's another one which she calls wonder. That is worth quite apart from my own sense of flourishing. There's a sense of that, and that all those are, if you like, wrapped up in how she thinks about compassion. Empathy, therefore, notes the otherness of the other. That is, it recognises that something is going on in the other in a way that emotional contagion does not. Emotional contagion is what many other animals can have, and that is, there's a sense in which that other individual's pain almost becomes mine, and that's called emotional contagion. Whereas empathy recognises it's really happening in someone else, and then compassion takes the next step and says, I need to do something about it. So she also argues that someone who has empathy may not necessarily lead to acts of compassion. It may lead to something worse. So it may lead, in other words, you could recognise that someone is suffering in a particular way and then go on to manipulate their particular intentions. And certainly in the way that it's used in torture and other things is a chilling example of the way empathy can be there, but then is used for more manipulative purposes. She argues as well that a step beyond that, where the person who's under attack is treated as if they have no emotions at all. So it's recognising the emotions in the other, and then using them for manipulative purposes is a kind of negative step that empathy can take. But then you can go beyond that and actually treat that person in a dehumanising way, and that's where there's no sense of empathy at all. Modern psychology, on the other hand, doesn't really define empathy quite the way Martha Nussbaum does. So in some issues, if you want to, and part of the difficulties, as in many areas in the evolution of morality, is that the way psychologists understand empathy is slightly different from the way philosophers understand it. And so trying to work out exactly whether they really are talking to one another or not is really quite complicated. Both desire to help the other in modern psychology. So you'll have compassion saying it's about desire to help the other, and empathy is about the desire to help the other, whereas Martha Nussbaum distinguishes the two by only giving compassion the active component of helping another. I think her definitions are rather clearer compared to the modern psychologists, but I think that we need to be aware that, when we're reading Nussbaum, that it is, we have to interpret it in the light of what psychologists are saying, in full awareness that her own definitions are slightly different. She also, on a more critical point of her work, it's one thing to correct her understanding of empathy in the light of modern psychology, but one of the more critical aspects of her work is that she fails to incorporate the more emotive elements of compassion, because she's so conscious of the need to bring in these rational elements. And so the particular element in question is that of love, which again Michael Spezio has paid a lot of attention to in some of his psychological work. So in other words, what is really motivating compassion is love, and yet the relationship between love and compassion barely gets a mention, or doesn't even get mentioned at all in her book on this topic. It also fits rather well with what Michael Spezio calls the predictive theories of the brain, where we start to imagine what the other in a healthy state, and that gives us another motivation to acting on their behalf. So we don't just look at them in their suffering and in their pain and in their distress. We sort of imagine them in this healthy state, and that helps us to act right in relation to them. So, you know, basically what I'm trying to say here is that Martha Nussbaum has given us a really interesting contribution to the discussion, but it needs filling out a little bit more in the light of modern psychology. Although her sort of clear definitions of the different judgments of compassion, I think, are quite helpful, but they need to be qualified by this understanding of love for the other as driving that compassionate act. Let's then look at the next step that I want to take, and that's the evolution of human compassion. And here's Henry Spickins, who's maybe not that well known to many of you here. What she does is look at what's happened in evolutionary history, and tries to work out what the intentions were of very early hominins towards one another. She also draws on some of the work of Franz de Waal that Bob mentioned at the start of my talk, work on primates, where he looks specifically at the emotions in other animals and also their particular agency in relation to altruism, altruistic acts and that kind of thing. So she assumes that, with de Waal, that there is this tower of morality that's built up, eventually finding its place in humans. I think that I've become more sceptical of that particular position now, partly because of my work with Agustin Fuentes, and he's reminded me that the division or the divergence between humans and all other primates was about 8 million years ago. So it's really difficult to be sure that what was happening in the lowest, the common ancestor of both primates and humans was similar to what's happening in primates now, and similar to what's happening in humans now. In other words, that it may be a convergence rather than a consistent homology, as evolutionary biologists call it. But leaving that to one side, I think it's interesting and I will go into more detail of the way Penny Spickins works this out and how she actually does this research. But before that, what I want to do is look at our own particular project on the evolution of wisdom. And here's Mark Hissel and Agustin Fuentes. I haven't got a pointer, but Mark Hissel is the one on the left, and Agustin Fuentes is the one on the right. Mark Hissel is a postdoctoral fellow who has worked with us on this evolution of wisdom project. And his job was to search back in the evolutionary record for non-material qualities. Evidences that something was going on in the minds of those early hominins that seemed to say something else about them other than simple function for practical purposes. So you might say, well, what on earth did he look at? Well, these are the kinds of things that he was interested in looking at. Red markings on ochre, scratchings on stones, particular tools, and so on and so forth. And they're all in the literature, but they haven't really been collated into a database before. And incidentally, this is one of the things that we're hoping Mark Graves will be able to help with as part of towards the end of this project, is to help that database get set up. The database is already existing, but we need some computerized expertise to get it on a solid platform. So this is what we find. If you look at the number of sites in the database by time period, you can see that as you go forward in time, back to 400 or so thousand years ago, the number of sites gets less and less. So it becomes more and more tenuous as to what we're saying about these things. But having said that, it's still possible to come to at least some preliminary conclusions. So you look for example, where are the earliest, what time period are the earliest engraved lines? And you can start to work it out, and you'll notice immediately that this isn't in South Africa, where much of the work has been done on early hominins. And so it starts to, and again, we've literally got dozens of these slides, which I can't show you all of them, but it challenges the kind of all or nothing thesis that's very common in the literature, even at the moment in most textbooks, that said that basically everything came out of Africa, and we went from anatomically modern humans to cognitively modern humans all in one step. It all happened sort of, relatively quickly in a very short space of time. But if you actually look at and that 200,000 years ago is the mark of the anatomically modern humans when they appeared. And if you look at the different bone technologies, the engraved lines, the earliest blades, the earliest figurative art, and the earliest wood weapons, and the earliest beads, and the earliest ochre use, they go back literally thousands of millions of years ago, or 400,000 years ago, not millions years ago, getting my fingers mixed up. So what do we do with that? What do we do with the fact that these technologies seem to appear and then disappear in the evolutionary record? Is it because the evidence is fragmentary? Or is something else going on? Is there some sort of hint that something is going on in the mind? Why would you have this figurative art appearing so early in the evolutionary record? 500, even in one example of that time period, and you can date these things pretty accurately. What about beads? Why would people use beads? It's certainly very different from anything that we know that other animals can do even today. So it suggests a different kind of mind or ability to do things is starting to emerge. And we call this the Evolution of Wisdom project, because we believe that these are complex signs or signifiers of something that tells us about quite detailed relationships between people and kind of marking points for those relationships. But compassion is something else again, because compassion, what's interesting about compassion is that it goes even further back, 1.5 million years ago. So it's even deeper than the wisdom threads that we've been looking at, the symbolic thinking that we've been looking at. And how do you tell whether it's really something that other animals are doing or whether it's distinctive for humans? Penny Spickins argues that many other primates, chimpanzees and others, will show compassion, but it's very fleeting and short term. What is distinctive in the Homo lineage is its ability to show long-term compassion. And as I said, it seems to go far deeper back in history than any of these other technologies. I'll just show you that. It's 700,000 years ago, and this is 1.5 million years ago. So a significant order of magnitude further back in time. And this is what Penny Spickins says here about this process. Understanding the evolution and role of compassion in past human species entails recognizing that compassion is more than just a feeling that we recognize as personal, but also in a wider analytical perspective, it is a biological response, a motivation to act whose roots lie in the hormonal and neurological workings of our mind. So she's interested in what's happening then to the minds of these very early hominins, human-like things. Again, this is far earlier than anything, far earlier than Homo sapiens. This is Homo agaster, dated to around 1.5 million years ago, and this is what she says about this particular sample. The most well-known early example of long-term support for an incapacitated individual comes from KNF-ER 1808. This is the way that archaeologists label their sources. A female Homo agaster dated to around 1.5 million years ago. Examination of the skeletal remains, and this is where it gets really interesting, of this individual have led to suggestions that she was suffering from hypervitaminosis A, a disease caused by excessive intake of vitamin A. So the symptoms can be tracked in human remains through the reduction in bone density and the development of coarse bone growth. So you only have the bones as remains, but you can see the changes in the bone texture, and that tells you that this individual had hypervitaminosis A. And what are the symptoms for these sufferers? And they're known from contemporary medical studies. Abdominal pain, nausea, headaches, dizziness, blurred vision, lethargy, loss of muscular coordination and impaired consciousness. And the pathology would have taken many months to develop, which shows that caretaking must have been in the long term, as the individual couldn't have survived on their own without intensive care of others. The point is that it involves long-term and sustained care of the type that you never see in other animals. And I'm not trying to suggest of creating a sharp division between humans and other animals. I've been working on that boundary for so long, I don't want to do that, but I'm saying there's something really distinctive about humans that is happening here. And it goes back very deep in our history. Let's look at another example. This is even earlier. It's at 1.77 billion years ago from the well-known Demansky site, archaeological site in Georgia, and she says this: one of the Demansky hominins had lost all but one tooth several years before death, with all the sockets except the canine teeth having been reabsorbed. Since it could only have consumed soft plants or animal foods, it seems very likely that it would have needed support from others. She says it, but presumably it's either he or she. So, again, an astonishing result. Let's look at another example, a little bit closer to home, as it were. Now we're in the Neanderthal lineage, which is concurrent with the Homo sapiens lineage. It's around 60 to 80,000 years ago. Around roughly the same sort of time as some of those other examples that I've spoken about of scratchings on stones and so on. And so Shanadar I, the old man of Shanadar, dating to around 60 to 80,000 BP, is perhaps one of the best known examples. This individual suffered multiple fractures across his body, with the right side being particularly badly affected and the right arm being described as completely withered. The individual received a crushing injury to his cranium, possibly causing blindness in his left eye due to the deformity of the skull. Close study of the bones showed that these injuries happened during adolescence, but the death happened at a relatively advanced age for a Neanderthal of 35 to 50 years. That person wasn't left just to rot. They were cared for over a sustained period ever since adolescence. It's a remarkable result. Another example she gives, and I haven't got a slide for this one, is a young child in the Middle Pleistocene. And this one had severe birth defects, or craniosyntoses, but this individual was kept alive till they were between 5 and 8 years old. And what's really interesting is that if you track the way people end up treating those with very similar diseases in the Middle Ages, many of these babies were just left to die in that period, and Penny Spicken speculates as to why it was that these very early hominins were caring for these babies in a way that seemed even to have been lost in relatively recent times. And she argues that there were 4 stages in the evolution of compassion. There was the first was a fairly fleeting stage that you find in other animals and hominins in general, and then there was much more sustained investment, and then there was more deliberative or committed approach to compassion for others, and then finally, in 120,000 years or so ago, compassion started to be extended to tools and other objects as well, kind of affiliated with the people who were originally associated with compassionate acts. So if we go back again to this slide I showed you earlier, it seems that these symbolic capacities appear and disappear. And you have to say, well, why is this such a sporadic process? Perhaps compassion even encouraged the accumulation of artifacts. At the same time, we shouldn't idealize this period of history or think that these hominin groups were living peacefully and compassionately, because alongside this increase in compassion, there was also an increase in violence. So we have that paradox of the human condition, where we're both more violent and more compassionate than any other living creature that we know of. So compassion then requires channeling empathy to particular moral ends, rather than not doing so. And if we go back to the arguments of the early church, including especially Thomas Aquinas, it's about the alignment of our irascible and concupiscible appetites and appetitive powers relative to our reason. So we need that reasoning element in order to be able to act aright, and that includes compassion. Of course, Thomas uses charity and misericordia. He doesn't use compassion as such, but and love or caritas is also extremely important for him. And he defines misericordia in 2 ways. When it's used where it's action on behalf of the other, then it means what we would call compassion. When it means removal of another's pain because of forgiveness of harm, then it means mercy. So we have these terms, mercy and compassion, quite closely related to each other. Compassion then is the effect that Thomas regards as necessary but not sufficient condition for mercy. So it's a little bit like empathy is required as a condition for compassion, and then compassion is required as a condition for mercy. And they build on one another like that. And so for him, mercy is a more developed virtue compared to compassion. His question on mercy, and this is getting technical now for those of you interested in Aquinas, his question on mercy is in the middle of the section on acts and effects of charity. And that is placed in itself in the central section of charity as part of the whole discussion of charity. Robert Minor, who's a scholar who's worked for years on Thomas and on his understanding of love in particular, says mercy lies at the very heart of Thomas's treatment of charity. So mercy is incredibly important for Thomas Aquinas. So misericordia then is action informed by right reason. And this is from this Summa Theologia, the second part of the second part. Question 34. Of all the virtues which have to do with our neighbour, however, misericordia is the greatest, even as its act surpasses all others. For to relieve the wants of another is, as such, the function of someone higher and better. So he says that just as we should aim at charity, that is love of God supremely, so mercy is the one that works in relation to our neighbour, and it's the one that we should, if you like, aim at, first of all. Infused virtues, on the other hand, are virtues which are given by the grace of God rather than acquired or learnt in our lifetime. And inasmuch as infused prudence is available, then infused prudence can guide the infused virtues of charity and the infused virtue of mercy. And this idea of infusion, I think, is another dimension that psychologists and others don't really take into account. So it seems to go sort of beyond what might be expected as possible according to sort of philosophical and even psychological reasoning. But on the other hand, there has been some really interesting examples from Michael Spezio again, from his work with the L'Arche communities, where you can sort of playfully speculate on maybe something interesting may be going on in the moral psychology. Because the L'Arche community helpers live with those with severe learning difficulties and with very severe physical disabilities. And they develop a particular psychology that all experiments show, that is psychological experiments, score very high on the empathy-compassion scale. But they also score incredibly high on the religious scale. And my speculation is this, complete speculation, is that maybe they have been recipients of a kind of infused virtue that brings both a very strong religious sense, but also this ability to go way beyond what most of us are able to do in terms of compassion. Now, the research is yet to actually ask them how they think they're able to act compassionately or not, and maybe then perhaps they're not even aware of it themselves. And perhaps if they were aware of it, it wouldn't be proper compassion anyway. So, but I think we can come to some tentative conclusions about all this debate. And thank you for staying with me so patiently. First of all, debates on empathy in contemporary psychology parallel the ancient philosophical discussion, except that there are elements of definition which are harder to work out, but the idea of anti-empathy, as it were, has been going on for centuries. So to say that this is a new finding or something, as Paul Bloom seems to suggest, is not really the case. I also think that we can perhaps be critical of Nussbaum in that she hasn't really taken quite enough account of the role of the emotions in compassion, and love in particular. Secondly, compassion in the long term is distinctively human. So Penny Spickins has done some really interesting research where she shows that this long-term compassionate care goes very deep in our human history. And it's something which I find incredibly interesting, that there are ways and means of looking at the bones and looking at the material evidences in the record, which gives us some indication of what was going on in the minds of those very early hominins. And it's the same with the wisdom work we've done as well. We get sort of hints or suggestions about what the evolution of wisdom may have looked like. Of course, evolutionary anthropologists may not always be comfortable calling it wisdom. They've used more characteristically the language of a symbol or the symbolic species. But wisdom is about a complex capacity in relation to others, in relation to a community. And it's that ability to think like that I think is really crucial in our own human evolution. Compassion and its limits is also integral to the Christian moral tradition. Misericordia is integral to caritas in Thomas, and I think that he was on the right track when he suggested as such. And then finally, infused virtues point to a psychology of grace and self for others. And that's all I want to say tonight, so I hope that you'll have a few questions so we can take the discussion forward. Thank you.